Hello, everyone. Welcome to Monday. We're so glad to have you with us here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. I'm Glenn, and we're going to have our weekly installment of Ask a Historian. And so we've gotten a couple of questions, a couple of updates, requests for some things we'd done in the past. And one of them was in terms of Benjamin Franklin. And we met him last Friday, and someone wanted to know a little bit more about his role in the abolitionist movement and slavery and things like that. And I think that's an important point to bring up about Benjamin Franklin and a lot of his contemporaries, because Benjamin Franklin is a great example of when you are looking at an individual from the past, you need to look at what we call the whole man or the whole person theory of history. And that is, you don't just look into one particular part of their life and try to pull out one particular quote and say, oh, well, that's a representation of that person. No, it's much more complicated than that, and as people look at it and think about it, you know, the question comes up, well, for you, for example, how would you like to be judged from your worst day or the worst thing you've ever said? That's not the way to approach things. And Benjamin Franklin, like so many other folks from our past, has an evolving approach to slavery as he goes through his life. And you see a sort of interesting parallel with Abraham Lincoln. When they're both young, when they're both born into a world where slavery exists. It is very common. And when someone has some wealth in the American colonies, they're almost always going to end up purchasing a slave and taking an enslaved person into their service, because that was an efficient form of labor. It's sort of, you know, you're trying to get work done and you don't have the time to do the work yourself, so you're going to purchase another person. And people at the time realized that this was a severe moral problem, and certain people, as they began to go through their life, much like Benjamin Franklin, when he began to apply his own tenets of what is good and what is fair and what is just. And as he went through his life, he began to see that slavery was not only a negative force in American society and American economy. He began to work more and more to have it removed. Now, and the question was that we got Friday, why didn't he do more at the Constitutional Convention to stop slavery from being put in there? Well, and his excuse was a fair one, and we have this in his writings. He and many others from the North felt that if they pushed that issue, the Constitutional Convention would fall apart. And remember, this is a very delicate time when they're trying to get a new nation and a form of government for this new nation created. And they need everyone to buy in and to be a part of the conversation. And Franklin, like many others, felt, let's get the government going, let's get it established, and we can begin to work for abolition and to have slavery removed from our way of life and our new nation as time goes on. And that is, in fact, what he did. One of his last, one of his last public acts was sending a letter to Congress, a very newly formed Congress, that laid out in no uncertain terms why slavery is bad and why slavery should be eliminated, period. Done. Stop. Even though this was not exactly what they had agreed to at the Constitutional Convention, and he, sitting in that body, he pushed to have slavery removed from the American system totally. And this was an evolution over time. As I said, Abraham Lincoln, you see sort of an evolution of his approach to slavery, and a lot of other people's. It's a process, like it is with everything in our lives. The more we grow, the more we learn, the more we think, the more experiences we have in our lifetime to sort of view the world, our opinions are going to, or at least they should, change in the face of new evidence. So that was a great question and a little bit of follow-up about Benjamin Franklin. And so, Lib, I think someone had asked about World War I.
Yes, Jackson, who is 7, asked, what was World War I like?
So Jackson wants to know, what was World War I like? Well, Jackson, that's a very broad topic. I think what you may be talking about is sort of what was it like to fight as an infantryman in World War I. Specifically, what most of us think of in World War I is that trench warfare. And this is when the two sides had settled down, and because the defensive weapons of the time had become so effective, artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, it makes it very, very difficult for infantry to attack and advance moving across ground. And so they set up these defensive positions, and in these trenches, these guys from the Atlantic Ocean all the way down to Switzerland, for several hundred miles, this trench system exists, and they just hunker down and they begin to develop and improve to a certain extent those trenches. They eat there, they sleep there, they fight there, and they're attacked there. So there's all kinds of artillery that would come in all the time, and they would have to like dig down into the earth to find a protective means of existing. So they would build their kitchens and things there. Their bunks would be there, and it was an absolutely horrific experience. I've done a lot of reading about a lot of different military history and a lot of different soldier experiences. And based on what I've read, now I've never been in combat myself, but based on what I've read, World War I must have been one of the most awful experiences, because you're in the same place, it's wet, it's raining, there's mud, it's cold, there's rats, there's constant threat of attack or artillery falling out of the sky and killing you like that, just randomly, and you're there for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. It's just constant. And there's no good way to get out of that unless your entire unit is able to pull back and get some rest while another unit goes in. So that's kind of what life was like in the trenches.
Now, some follow-up questions. Can you talk about what started World War I and how many countries were involved?
So some follow-ups. What started World War I and how many countries were involved? I don't know the exact number of countries that were involved. Eventually, it involved a whole lot. World War I, the beginning of it is also very, very complex, and it arises out of some competition between some of the larger countries. The larger countries involved are the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, Great Britain, France, Austria, I should say Austro-Hungarian Empire, and of course Germany. And all these countries are competing for a lot of different things. They're competing for colonies overseas. They're competing for influence amongst their neighbors. They each want to have the biggest army or the biggest navy, because if you have the biggest army or the biggest navy, you don't necessarily have to go to war. Just the threat of having a force so powerful would force other nations to sort of agree to your course of wants and the direction you wanted things to go. And so this had been building up and building up. And one of the things these countries had done to secure their safety had been to go into treaties with other countries, right? So if two countries joined together and agreed to defend each other, they're going to be stronger than this one other country here. So you have a series of treaty systems in place. And that's really, you have to think of World War I sort of as a giant keg of gunpowder, right? And over time, over 10, 20, 25 years, these world events continue to just fill and fill and fill and fill this keg of gunpowder. And all that gunpowder needs is a spark to set it off and cause the war. And that spark is when a young revolutionary kills the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? He shoots him when he's traveling in a car, jumps on the car, shoots he and his wife dead. Well, because of that, in Serbia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire declares war on Serbia because of this Serbian nationalist effort to kill their person. And then Russia comes in and says, well, you can't do that. We're going to defend Serbia. And then Germany says, well, we're going to ally ourselves with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then France and Great Britain and all these other countries immediately just whoosh. And within just a month, they're all at war with each other because of all these treaty negotiations that they had had before the war. That assassination is the spark that goes into that big gunpowder keg, if that makes any sense. So it's not just the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's just what sets everything off. It's a very, very complicated, convoluted occurrence.
All right. We have one question. Is it true women hid messages in their knitting during wartime and passed them along to allies? Can you discuss other ways to get secret messages?
So one of the questions is it true that women might have hidden messages in their knitting or things like that to get messages across enemy lines. I'm not sure which war that person's talking about, but maybe Revolutionary, maybe Civil War, but moving messages for spies has always been something that has been tricky because, of course, the real danger is if you get caught with your, number one, if you get caught with your message, you will be discovered as a spy and probably killed. Because there are, if you're a spy, if you're caught as a spy, it's different than being caught as a soldier. If you're in uniform, then there are certain rules that go into place with becoming a prisoner of war. If you're a spy, you're done. So you have to make sure that the message doesn't get you caught, and you have to make sure that the message can get through. That's the entire point, right, is getting the information to who needs from one side of the lines to the other so that they can act on that. So they come up with some pretty ingenious ways to do this. Of course, you can always just have someone remember the message, but what if they misremember or get it wrong? There could also be codes, right? So instead of saying that, for example, General Washington is going to move his army to New Jersey, then instead of writing that out, Washington and Army in New Jersey might simply have a series of numbers assigned to them, like 3, 6, 12. And all you would have to do is from your code book, look at those up, write down 3, 6, 12 on a slip of paper, put it in something to hide it, and then send it across the lines. And then the person you're sending it to will also have a code book. And they'll see the numbers 3, 6, 12, and they'll find those, and it says Washington, Army, New Jersey. Well, that's the key. And the way they would slip these messages through sometimes could be very ingenious. They might put it in their knitting. They might cut open their coats and sew it into their coat so that it could be hidden. Sometimes they would even have like a small, like a lead ball, right? It would look like a lead ball, but it could actually be screwed apart and it would be hollow inside. And you could put the message in and just put it in the pile of other musket balls, and it may escape notice that way. So there's a lot of different ways they can move those secret messages and encode them that would help keep it secret and help keep the spy safe and get the information through. There's plenty of research you can do. There's lots of neat activities you can find online. I encourage you to go look up Invisible Ink, because even though we're in quarantine at home, writing with Invisible Ink is something that students and parents can do at home, and it's a really fun hands-on activity.
All right. We have a question about local history, about the rock that is housed at Brunel. Can you tell us about the legend behind it? Is it authentic? And did it really come from Roanoke?
Oh, okay. So yeah, so this is some local history. So we have here at Brunel University these things called the Dare Stones. Basically, the history is, so the Roanoke colony, the lost colony, the British come, they put a colony on Roanoke Island in what's now North Carolina, the colony of North Carolina. They leave some people there, and they're like, okay, here's the colony, here's your supplies, we're going to go back to England, we're going to come back in a little less than a year, bring more supplies, and bring more colonists. So the ship sails away. The ship comes back, and the colony's gone. It's empty. There's no one there. It's a great mystery. And one of the only things they find is written on a tree. It says Croatoan. But, so the legend goes, people who began to look through the woods to see if there was anything, they found a stone. And this stone had scribbled on it a message from Virginia Dare, who was one of the children who was in this colony. I can't remember if she was born on the way here or she was actually born in the colony. But and so apparently she might have left this message scribbled on this stone, right? And it, you can go online and see it. It has, they came for us and then we had to leave, and I'm going to leave a series of stones so that you can find us later. And skip way forward to I think the 1930s, and someone found this stone. And it became a sensation, and they were like, ooh, this could explain what happened to the lost colony. Maybe there are more stones. And so these fellows began to go out looking for these other stones, and lo and behold, they found the other stones, or at least some stones with some inscriptions on them. They looked very different from this first stone. And a great controversy came up as to whether all of these stones were authentic. Could they really be messages from the lost colony? They were found different places and things like that. And they Bernal worked with some research historians, and I think it was the Discovery Channel. They had maybe it was the History Channel. I can't remember. I apologize. But they did a documentary on these stones and a more detailed history of the stones, and what they were able to determine, they're pretty sure, is that first stone that they found was original. It does, from all indications, seem to date to that time period. The way the language is written, the type of stone that it is would be native to that area and things like that. These other stones that were found are probably forgeries and not actual messages from Virginia Dare or any of her compatriots. But it's still a really neat story. It's one of those great historical mysteries that we just don't know the answer to, and especially this first stone, which is probably authentic, can only feed the interest and the intrigue behind something like a lost colony.
Can you talk about the timeline of women being in combat?
So the question is, or the request is for me to talk a little bit about the timeline of women being in combat. Yes, a little bit. It's dependent on how far back you want the timeline to go, right? There are accounts of women participating in battle very early on in the Iron Age, some of the Germanic cultures and things like that. Even in some of the Viking cultures, part of their pantheon, part of their religion has Valkyries who will come down and are sort of militarized females within that specific society and could fight and gathered up the best warriors and took them to Valhalla. There's no question that women did sometimes fight. Some of them through necessity. If your town or your village is being overrun, you might want to fight back and pick up the nearest weapon and so that you could fight. As far as women being trained as warriors, that one's a little harder to know. It's a little more controversial. The evidence doesn't seem to suggest that it was very common at all. If it did happen, and it could have happened here and there, it was not a common occurrence in the early days, right? So as we go forward, and especially in Western culture, which I have to focus on because that's my area of expertise when it comes to military history, women were just simply not considered part of the military system. They were not considered part of conscription. They were not considered part of the fighting forces. That really sort of began to change in the mid-20th century, right? So for a couple of different reasons. One is that women's suffrage had sort of happened, and people had begun to realize that women could take an active role not only in the political systems, but also in the economic and perhaps the military systems. And the necessity in World War II required that as many people, not just men, but as many people as possible could contribute to the war effort. So you start to see, like in Great Britain, in the United States and places like that, women being called into military service, not necessarily as combatants, but to do a lot of jobs so that men could be freed up. Now, in the Soviet Union, in World War II, it was somewhat different. They needed everyone they could get to contribute to the fighting efforts of the motherland. And so there are entire fighter units of women in the Soviet Army. And they were kind of given not very good airplanes, but they were so aggressive that they scared the Germans to death. These women would be in these old biplanes. And one good thing about a biplane is it has so much wing, it can just sort of coast. So these women would come into where they thought the Germans were, turn their engine off so the Germans couldn't hear them coming, and then just strafe the entire area, kick the engine back in and take back off and come around and do it again. The Soviets had several very, very successful, very, very popularized women snipers. They seem to argue that there was something about a woman's psyche that made her perhaps a better sniper than your average male because they were very quiet. They had a good deal of patience, right? They could just go to one place and stay there as long as it took to get the job done. They're less fidgety, if you will. And so after World War II, it had been seen that women could sort of fight and participate in combat. And while the military was still somewhat resistant to that idea, as time goes on, women are pulled more and more into military activity. The Israeli army, when it introduced conscription, conscripted men and women equally. And women are pulled into infantry units just the same as the men are. Again, because one of the reasons is partially because of equal rights, but also significantly because they just don't have that many numbers and they need every body available to defend their country. So they just pull everyone in. And as time has gone on, even though they haven't really let women be in combat roles, the way the modern battlefield works is some of those roles that women are allowed to do come so close to combat that they are in effect combat, like helicopter pilots or medics and doctors or supply folks, right? If you're a female supply driver and driving a supply truck and you get attacked, it's not like you're going to say, whoa, I'm a woman, I'm not allowed to fight. You're going to grab your rifle and you're going to start popping caps. So by necessity, because of the modern battlefield, women are being pulled more and more into combat. And it looks like if things keep up, they're going to be integrated at one level or another into most aspects of our fighting forces. In a nutshell, that's the scope of women in combat.
Very cool.
So,
okay, some more questions about women's history. Why did Queen Victoria not push women's rights more? She had a huge opportunity sitting and seems to have done nothing with it.
So the question is, why did Queen Victoria, not do more to push women's rights? She was queen of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Why didn't she use that influence to make things happen? Well, probably the quickest and easiest answer, at least as far as I understand it, my friend Leslie could probably give me a better answer on this, is that she wasn't a feminist. She didn't believe that women should have equal rights to men. She believed in the sanctity of domestic life. She believed in the traditional roles that women had held in the home and in their society. Of course, she could do what she wanted. She was appointed by God to be the sovereign queen of the British Empire. But that was an exception and should not be taken as the rule. And as a result, she wasn't interested in equal rights for women or in suffrage movements and things like that. So I think in basically put, that's why she didn't think it should happen. Now, whether she was right or not in that's a discussion for another day. But that was her, as I understand it, her personal belief.
So can you talk about the trajectory of women's rights in America?
Oh, so the trajectory of women's rights in America. Another complicated subject going all the way back to initial colonization. Initial colonization was carried out mostly by men. And you have to remember that a significant aspect of why men maintain their societal superiority in times like these arises from some biological aspects, like they have more upper body strength, right? It's easier to farm and to do manual labor with this upper body strength, and therefore generally men have more stronger upper body strength than women. So they're the ones who are sent to do all this awful manual labor in the New World, but they also need to start building the colony, so eventually women are sent over, and in some instances they're sent over and they would put them out for bid. Who wants this wife? Well, bid on the wives, and whoever pays the most gets this person as a wife. Not very egalitarian. Now, as time goes by and we get to the pre-revolutionary period, the New World, the colonies have a lot of successful merchant efforts and plantation efforts and things like that. Women are still not granted equality in terms of political voice, but economic voice, if they're a widow, if they're a dowager, they have a lot of leeway on whether they can hold property and things like that. Let me make sure I don't neglect the story of Native American women. Native American women, again, there are many, many different tribes and nations, but generally speaking, they held almost equal political say with the men. And most of the time, especially amongst the Cherokee, for example, descent in your family was considered matriarchal. You counted your descent from your mom's side of the family, not your dad's. So among Native American tribes, women would often have much, much greater equality economically and politically than their white European counterparts. As time goes by, women start to push a little bit more, but really the crux of it comes with the abolition movement in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, because men and women, over the issue of African Americans being enslaved, begin to realize that equality for all means equality for all, not just basing that on race, but also on gender. And so this gets the suffrage movement and the women's rights movement really going during the abolitionist times before the Civil War. And once the 15th Amendment grants men the right to vote, but not women, then the women begin to focus totally on women's causes. And of course, it's not until 1919 that the 19th Amendment is passed, and it's not until the next year that it's ratified and women get the right to vote throughout the country. Now, the right to vote is not political, social, economic egalitarianism, right? That's just one step. And that has continued up through the present day. How close we are to egalitarianism between the genders, I'm going to say that's a political debate and not necessarily a historical debate at this point, because we simply don't have the time to go into all that. But it has been a steady progression, I think. It is, but it's something that a lot of people have had to work on, and not just women, right? It's been, while women got resistance from most men, as time has gone by, they're getting less and less resistance from more and more men. So it's starting to take hold.
All right, so this question is, what is the weirdest animal that has ever been in the White House? And I do have a list of strange pets if you don't already.
Oh, so yeah, the question is, what is the weirdest pet that's ever been in the White House? There was a raccoon, I think. Yeah. Teddy Roosevelt had something weird too.
I found an alligator.
Yeah, an alligator. Thomas Jefferson had a pet bird that would perch on his shoulder and would annoy people, but he loved it and would feed it.
There was a pony as well, a parrot.
Yeah.
Andrew Jackson had a parrot.
Andrew Jackson had a parrot that he also enjoyed. Lots of people have had dogs, but
also found there were some sheep who grazed in front of.
Yeah, they used to have sheep graze in front of the White House. It's a big, beautiful yard, and the grass needs to be cut, so why not have some critters out there?
2 tiger cubs?
Martin Van Buren was given 2 tiger cubs while he was president, and I would imagine he's like, wow, thanks. Because he knows those tiger cubs are going to get pretty big. Yeah. So anyway, that's part of the benefit of being president of the United States. You have a lot of leeway in what you're able to do, and it always makes a good story when you're able to bring in something unique like that.
I'm putting a link in the chat.
Okay, yeah, Libba's going to put a link in the chat so that you can go and get more detail on some of the pets in the White House.
All right. So our next question is about. Now we want to know more about World War II. So, did World War II actually start for the U.S. when the Lusitania was sunk, and who fought in World War II?
So World War II? Mm-hmm. Okay, so.
I see.
Yes, so the question is, the World War II, when did the U.S. get involved and things like that? And I think the student had asked about the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania is World War I. That was it was a neutral ship that was attacked with Americans on board for World War I and helped push the United States to almost declaring war, but then the United States backed off when Germany made some promises to not do that anymore. World War II is a little different. And this is something when I always teach my classes, I always ask the question, when did World War II begin? And many people say, December 7th, 1941, which is when Japan bombed America's base at Pearl Harbor, and we declared war on them the next day. Well, some people say it was September 1st, 1939, when Germany invades Poland. And then Great Britain and France declare war against Germany. But is that really when it began? I mean, Hitler and Germany had already gone into Czechoslovakia before this. They had already, had Anschluss and annexed Austria. Ask the Chinese people when World War II started. Japan had invaded China in the early 30s. And that directly led to a lot of the issues that brought us to Pearl Harbor. So, a lot of the history books and a lot of the websites and things say it was September 1st when Germany invaded Poland. But the things that lead us to World War II, as with almost anything else, right? Glenn's second rule of history, everything is complex. And the things that get us there happen before that date. It's not like the world woke up on September 2nd and said, holy moly, we're all at war. Lots of things brought us to that point. And, that's just, Pearl Harbor was sort of the last time that a major belligerent came into the war. And so we declared war on Japan on December 8th. And then, ironically, and a couple of days later, Germany declares war on us to support their ally, Japan. If I'm not mistaken, I think of all the aggression that Germany actually carried out, I think that's the only time they ever declared war was on the United States, and then we turned around and immediately declared war on Germany. And that sort of is the last point of getting everyone involved and turns it into truly a worldwide conflict. But there were lots of other issues and lots of other items that contribute to that beforehand.
We want to know, was there a relationship between Alexander Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin? Did they ever work together? If not, can you talk more about Hamilton?
Oh, so the question was, did Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton ever work together? Did they know each other? I'm sure they did know each other. They were both at the Constitutional Convention together. They were certainly of two different generations. Again, Benjamin Franklin was the great elder statesman of America, of the United States, at the time of the Constitutional Convention. He was about 80 years old. Alexander Hamilton was very young. And two different generations probably had a different idea of what America is going to be. I don't know if they worked that closely together. I don't, off the top of my head, know of any writings from Benjamin Franklin where he would share his thoughts on Alexander Hamilton. But Alexander Hamilton came to be one of those big players in the early days of the American Republic. He had been sort of a self-made man. He had found himself as one of General Washington's aides during the American Revolution, very close to the general, sort of wanted the general to accept him as one of his sons, as an adopted son. He certainly considered Washington a father figure. They had a falling out. And then Alexander Hamilton does lead one of the main attacks at the Battle of Yorktown, which of course helps seal American victory and American independence. And then after that, Alexander Hamilton got involved in a lot of different things and was very vocal at the Constitutional Convention. That's where most of the leaders, the founding fathers of the country, would have gotten to know him more intimately and more directly. Hamilton, without question, was a genius. He was a very quick mind. He had a fantastic grasp of finance and politics. Super energetic. He didn't, if he had something on his mind, he wouldn't sleep. He would just sit and write and figure until he'd come up with a solution. But he was somewhat questionable in terms of his character. A lot of people, I think, today want to think of Hamilton as the Hamilton from the musical. And the Hamilton from the musical and the musical itself is probably some pretty good entertainment, but it's not very good history. I hate to disappoint you in. Hamilton was one of those folks that was wanting to get rich. He was all about making sure that his friends knew insider information and could get rich based on the things that were being decided within Congress. There's no question that by today's standards, he would have been incredibly guilty of insider trading by defrauding hundreds and thousands of American veterans of the American Revolution out of their land grants and their pay to enrich his fellows. He very much believed in the Bank of the United States. He very much believed that the economy of the United States should compete with that of Great Britain. And he believed that the country should be ruled by, quote, the wise, the rich, and the well-born. He did not he was not a fan of widespread enfranchisement or egalitarianism. He believed that the United States should model as closely as possible the political and the economic path that Great Britain had set. That being said, he was still a genius, and he was still a very active person. And had he not been killed in a duel, he probably would have become much, much more influential in American politics.
Today is Ulysses S. Grant's birthday. Can you tell us what you know about him?
So today is Ulysses S. Grant's birthday. Happy birthday, General and President Grant. What are some of the things to know about Grant? Interesting fellow. He comes to be, of course, the main general, the war hero, as it were, from the Civil War for the Union side. He was not he went to West Point. He served in the Mexican War. But after the Mexican War, he did not do too well. He had a couple of failed businesses. Didn't think he would ever go back into the military. Didn't have very many friends. I'm not sure about his marriage, his family life. But when the war starts, he's like, well, I guess I should go do something. And he's put in charge of a regiment. He's a colonel. And it doesn't look like at this point Grant is going to amount to much of anything. But he starts to do very well in his leadership and in his in the way he prosecutes the war. And he gets some of those. He's promoted to the point where he gets a couple of those early important victories in 1862 when he captures Forts Henry and Donelson and sort of takes control of the Tennessee River, at least in that area, for the Union. And he continues to have success after success. He's the victor of the Battle of Shiloh. At that point, the deadliest battle that had been fought on the North American continent. More men died at the Battle of Shiloh than had died in all other previous wars of America combined. So just to show you how bloody that battle was. And eventually, he's placed in command of all the Union armies by Abraham Lincoln. He's accused of drinking too much. And Lincoln says, well, whatever he's drinking, let me get some more of it for the rest of my generals because he seems to be the only one who can win battles. So Grant goes on. He sees that the way to Union victory is just massive obliteration of the Confederacy, and he kind of knows he has an advantage in manpower, and he takes advantage of that. His armies withstand a lot of casualties, take a lot of casualties, but they do eventually force the capitulation of the Confederacy, and he is considered the great Union general. And as a result of that, he's elected to the presidency in just a few years. After Andrew Johnson's terms, he's put up as president, becomes president, and serves 2 terms, but his presidency is not very good. It's filled with a lot of corruption. He's a great military leader, but he's not that good a judge of politics or of political leadership. And he doesn't take a strong hand with these folks, and it's full of corruption. And by the end of his presidency, he knows that he's not going to be president again. He knows that his legacy is pretty bad. He's almost broke, and in the last days of his life, he has throat cancer. He's dying of throat cancer, and he finishes his memoirs, and the sale of his memoirs is able to make him and his family solvent again before he dies. So that's Ulysses S. Grant, a very interesting fellow, one of those men who knew how to win a war, Sherman was always his subordinate in the war, but Sherman may have been a better modern battlefield commander. But we can debate about that another day.
So we have a question perhaps outside of your realm of knowledge, but it's about what is the process of mummification?
Ooh, I know a little bit about mummification. So mummification is something that's popularized mostly from ancient Egypt, right? This is part of their religion, and they would want the body to go as intact as possible into the afterlife. And so it's a very, let's say, active form of embalming. So they had to take organs out of the body, specific organs they would take out of the body and put them in little specific jars to keep them separate. And so like the brain was one. So they would insert a hook through your nose. You're dead by this point, by the way, so don't freak out. They would put a big metal hook up your nose and get a hold of your brains and take those out. right, and put those in a jar, and then they'd go inside and they'd take out your heart and your liver and things like that and lay them out and let them dry, and then they would put them in jars. I think they would put the heart back in the body depending upon which type of embalming you would get. They would use all kinds of solutions of like vinegar and wine to rinse the body, and then they would put it in salt and let this. And this is a way you still preserve meat, right? Bacon and ham and things use salt to preserve meat. Same thing with the human body. They would put it in salt, and then they would stuff the body with like sand and stuff, and then use linen to wrap, and just wrap it up, which is where you get the classic mummy. Now, there were different stages of this, and depending upon your level of wealth, you would get up to certain parts done. But of course, if you were the pharaoh, if you were a part of the pharaoh's family, you would get the good treatment. You would get all this done, and the jars would be made of gold and alabaster and things like that. If you were not quite rich enough, it may just be clay jars. But there were definitely payment levels that you're going to get with a quality of service with embalming. And the idea was, again, that the body would arrive as intact as possible into the afterlife. And again, sometimes the mummified body would simply be put in a grave, lined with stones, and then a stone would be put on top of it. Sometimes they would get entire tombs and pyramids if they're the pharaohs. So it's a very interesting process. It's a very invasive process, but you can see some of the pictures and see some of the ways these bodies have been preserved, and it does a pretty good job of preserving the body when you can still make out a lot of the facial characteristics of someone who was mummified about 3,000 years ago. That's good science.
So we want to know what happened to the third atomic bomb that was going to be dropped on Japan.
So the question is, what happened to the third atomic bomb that was going to be dropped on Japan? Well, let me back up. So at one of the great concerns, everyone knew that there was a possibility of an atomic bomb, a bomb with incredible destructive power based on atomic theories of fission and fusion and things like that. The Germans were trying to develop a bomb, and this is what drove the Americans to develop a bomb, because they were afraid that if Germany got it first, there would be no way to prevent or retaliate against that. So the Americans began to develop one based on the advice of Albert Einstein. Turns out the Germans weren't nearly as close as we were afraid they were. The Japanese weren't even remotely close. The British didn't have the resources to put into it. They sort of depended upon the Americans. The Americans developed atomic bombs. And so we have two different types of atomic bombs prepared. You have to, and this is the biggest effort that the United States did during World War II in terms of money involved and in terms of a lot of resources. Because to make atomic bombs work, you can't just use regular dynamite or explosives. It takes uranium and not plutonium, but one of them takes plutonium, but mostly uranium. And you can't just get that stuff out of the ground. It has to be processed. And so up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, there was a huge top secret facility that people would work to enrich the uranium. And it was so secret that people would go into work and they didn't know what they were doing. They just stood in a box and they said, "We need you to do this thing." "What am I doing?" "Don't worry about it. Just do this thing all day long for 3 years." And eventually they got enough uranium. They went out to the Trinity site in New Mexico to test and make sure the bombs would work. They did work. Actually, they knew one type would work. They just had to test the other one. And so the idea was to use it to end the war quickly against Japan. And so a single bomber takes off, the Enola Gay, and drops an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1945. The United States says, "You should surrender now. This could happen again." The Japanese are not interested. They drop another bomb on Nagasaki from a plane called Bockscar, Bock''S''AR. It's a play on words there. And they drop that on August 8th. Japan, a long story short, Japan finally agrees to surrender, but the United States had said, "We're going to drop another bomb." The trouble was, we didn't really have enough fissible material to get a third bomb going at this point. It would have taken several weeks as I understand it, to get that bomb ready. So we could have dropped another bomb, but it would have been several weeks, and by that point, Japan may have called a bluff. So that was the story with the third bomb. But of course, after the war, we were afraid that other powers were going to get it, especially the Soviet Union. So we began to process and build up our atomic forces as quick as we could, which leads directly to the Cold War, which, by the way, we're going to have a special show on tomorrow at 2. So be sure you tune in for that.
All right. We want to know, did people hang quilts outside that helped runaway slaves find their way to freedom based on the patterns? Now, I did a little bit of research. Seems like it's more of legend than history.
Yes.
You could talk more about what abolitionists did.
Yeah, so the question was the Underground Railroad, the secret pathway and guides that would help slaves escape from the South to the North before and during the Civil War. Did they hang quilts outside that had secret messages to give information to people escaping so that they would know that this was a safe space or they needed to move on or something like that? This was a theory that was put forward several years ago, and it has more or less been debunked. A lot of these quilts are very beautifully made, and they have a lot of neat symbology and a lot of artistic expression that goes into them, but there's no real evidence that they were secret messages or anything like that. There were lots of other ways that folks could communicate about safe spaces and certain paths and helpers on the Underground Railroad, but quilts are not one of them. Now, and it's also, when we're talking about the Underground Railroad, it's important to remember that it was neither underground nor was it an actual railroad, right? This was not trains, and it was not hidden underground to allow slaves to escape that way. It's not like a subway. That was merely the words that they used. A railroad, of course, is just a path that you can take. It's a means of transportation. And underground didn't necessarily mean under the ground literally, but it meant like secretive and hidden. So this is the term, this is where we get Underground Railroad, and the Underground Railroad helped thousands of slaves escape. But again, they had to be super secret. And that's another, we talked about spies at the beginning. I know there's a lot of interest in sort of that spy and secret work and things like that. That stuff's been going on since the BC days. But the Underground Railroad is really interesting because it's something that was developed by a lot of enslaved people and a lot of people that the slave owners thought could never be smart enough to develop something like this, and yet there they were creating the system whereby thousands were able to get freedom.
All right. We have a question from someone from Pennsylvania knows that James Buchanan is the only president elected from Pennsylvania. What's your opinion of James Buchanan as president?
So one of our Pennsylvania viewers wants to know about James Buchanan, and being the only president elected from Pennsylvania, what's my personal opinion of him? Poor Buchanan. He's not really one of those that has made a name or a mark for himself. It's just sort of, hello, I'm James Buchanan. There's not much to be said. There were no big wars that took place during his presidency. Things were generally economically stable during his presidency. And you would think, it's a good point though, you would think with as large and populous a state as Pennsylvania is and how much power it can carry in a national election that we haven't had more than one president from that great big state. So, who knows, maybe in the next 10 or 12 years we'll be able to rectify that.
So, can you talk about life in early Rome?
So someone wants me to sort of explain life in early Rome. Well, like most things, it depends on who you were and what your station was. There were, of course, the incredibly poor, the incredibly rich, and most people were generally in between, although they tended more to be somewhat poor. It was still based, and when you say Rome, I'm going to assume you mean, the city of Rome and the area that it controlled. Of course, if you lived in the city, that's really where the richest and the poorest tended to be. You were there, that was the center of commerce. That's where the trading would take place. That's where government was held. So a lot of the wealthy had homes in Rome, but most of the wealthy had their bigger estates and they preferred to spend time out in the country because, of course, cities are places of political power and culture and art and beauty and beautiful architecture, but they're also filled with disease and crime and riots and starvation and things like that. So the rich people would have their homes outside in the country, and they lived very well. And they were, when they had kids, when they had families, those kids were brought up to fulfill their roles. The women were brought up to be good wives and matriarchs for the family, and the men were considered to be, they were going to do military service, and then they were eventually going to perhaps go into the Senate, or at least do things that were expected of the patrician class. For most people are going to be farmers. Again, the way most people made a living throughout most of human history is to farm the land, to till the earth. And that means that they're going to be subject to bounty crops, bumper crops where it was a great year and they were able to have an excess of product that they could perhaps sell and put a little money aside. There's going to be bad years and that will lead to famine. But generally speaking, the people in the country were able to maintain starvation better than in the city, right? If that's where the food's being grown, they're going to hold on to enough to feed themselves and then only sell, if there is any surplus, sell that surplus. But the cities, not having farms inside the cities, are going to depend totally on the outlying areas to supply them with food and things like that. So that creates a big frictive dynamic between the city dwellers and the country dwellers. Life expectancy is not super high. You're looking at maybe 50s to 60s. This is the time when infant mortality rate is going to be very, very high. So, it's not like they're in abject poverty, but they're certainly going to have a harder life, much closer to the folks on the American frontier than they are to us.
Okay. Can you talk about Amelia Earhart? Do we know what happened to her?
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about Amelia Earhart. She was certainly a pioneer of aviation. Again, this is a time when a woman doing these things seemed somewhat outrageous and unexpected, and yet a lot of her fellow aviators recognized her skill and her adventurous spirit. And this is back when they were called aviatrix. She was an aviatrix, which is just a cooler name, if you ask me. And so she was involved in that early time of aviation development. And so we're not sure exactly what happened to her. She took off. She was trying to get across the Pacific. And we lost contact. Remember, this is in the days before really good radios. This is certainly the days before GPS or anything like that. And so when she takes off, we get a little bit of a message from her. I think she lands on one island and refuels, takes back off. We never hear from her again. And there have been a lot of folks who have gone and tried to find where her airplane could be. They've used sonar from ships looking on the surface of the ocean. They've looked at a lot of different islands. They haven't been able to find anything. So she's one of those American history mysteries that we just don't know, and we probably never will know what happened to her. But she's left enough of a legacy as an adventurous spirit and someone that a lot of people, especially young girls, can take hope from and use as a role model.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have two more questions. First one is, can you talk about Napoleon?
The question is, can I talk about Napoleon? Can I talk about Napoleon? What an interesting fellow. So again, someone who I think we just like stories about people who come up from almost nothing and get to the absolute top of their game. Napoleon was not French. He was Corsican, which is an island in the Mediterranean that was under, when he was born, which was under French control. And he comes up, they recognize he's a very intelligent kid. He was born into the very, very lower nobility, so that means he wasn't in poverty, but he wasn't that much far out of it in Corsica. But they send him to school in France, and the kids, of course, all make fun of him because, you remember, his name, we think of Napoleon as a very French name, but his name was Napoleone Bonaparte, right? That's not French. That's much closer to Italian. So he gets made fun of, but he dedicates himself to learning the French language, and he wants to be a soldier. From the very, very beginning, he wants to be a soldier. And he goes to school to learn how to work with artillery. And when the French Revolution comes, fortunately, he picks the right side, and they realize someone who's very, very ambitious and someone who is willing to do what needs to happen to win. And one of the things that really sets him apart in these early days is the government that has been set up is afraid that the riots in Paris are going to push it down and pull it down and cause a new government to be put into place. They need someone to stop this rioting. And Napoleon says, well, give me 3 cannon and I can do it. So he takes the cannons and soldiers out onto the streets, and when the French mobs start coming, he fires into them and kills a whole lot of them. Well, now everyone knows that he means business, and so they start putting more and more trust in him. He's put in command of armies, which is where he gets a lot of military experience, but he also gets the loyalty of his soldiers. He's a fantastic, fantastic leader. And, you know, that's one of the things when you study military history, you can get a little bit out of the way Napoleon was able to use armies and tactics and things like that. What you really want to study, if you want to know about how to apply those lessons, is how he was able to inspire men, how he was able to lead them through just awful experiences and somehow pull out victories again and again. And he comes to be head of the government in France and eventually is crowned emperor of the French. Now, this is not a king, right? A king gets it just because he was born. An emperor is elected by the people. That's the difference. Sometimes it's a very, very thin line, but nevertheless, there you are. And at the height of his power in about 1806, he has the entire part of Western Europe under his direct or indirect control. And that's when he starts to go too far, right? He has Austria, Italy, France, of course, the German states, Prussia, and even Russia, sort of, if he hasn't conquered them, they're at least doing his bidding. He's master of Europe. And the only people standing against him are the British and a little bit of the Spanish down there. And it's the Spanish that sort of keep him from taking the entire continent. And at that point, he begins to overreach, because to maintain these wars takes a lot of money and a lot of men. He's able to get some of those from his allies, but most of it still has to come from France. And by the time you get to the later part of his reign, there's just not that much left. They are able to, there's a coalition that defeats him and forces him to go into exile on the island of Elba. But in less than a year's time, he comes back to France. He gathers an army again, and he goes to fight the British at Waterloo. And at this battle, he is finally defeated and exiled to an island, and he dies there, let's see, what is that, 6 years later, I believe. So, but the thing is, we see Napoleon, it's very interesting the way he's seen from history. He was very much described at the time as the monster of Europe and his horrible person. But he also put into place civil codes and ways to govern people that are still in a lot of countries today, especially France. And unfortunately, a lot of people have sort of compared him to Hitler in terms of this desire to control Europe. But I think that they are, this is me personally, they are two very, very different people. One wanted to consolidate Europe because he thought Europe should be this one grand place. The other was a madman who wanted to kill everyone who he didn't like. So that's Napoleon.
All right, our last question is, did Alexander the Great have any pets?
Okay, yeah, so the question is, did Alexander the Great have any pets? He did, because he went all over the world and pulled out all sorts of stuff.
But he had one dog who was named Peritus.
Yeah.
He took on his military exploit.
Oh, yeah, so a dog named Peritus, and he probably had it better than most of Alexander's soldiers, because if you're the great's dog, you're going to get super special treatment. He also, I think, kept, again, elephants, right? This is people that are not used to elephants. They are a very wonderful, exotic thing. And so I think he captured a couple of elephants and sort of had them paraded around his camp just as something neat to see.
And apparently he named a city after his dog after it died.
Oh, yeah, so after his dog's death, it looks like he named a city after the dog.
All right, that's our last question.
All right, folks. Well, thank you for joining us today for Ask a Historian. I always love getting these questions. I love being able to help any way I can, and I just love talking about history. I appreciate you spending this time with me and with the Northeast Georgia History Center. As I said, tomorrow we're going to be looking at the Cold War. Maria Walker is going to be joining us because she's been doing some work with that on her senior research. And we have a great lineup this week, so check that out. If you can support us financially, please go to our website and click on that donate button. If you can't, that's okay. Just please keep watching and please keep telling all your friends and family to join us. So until then, take care, and I'll see you later.